Hello, I'm Francesca Boyd. I'm honoured to welcome you to AIPH's Green City Briefing series. We have a wonderful webinar ahead of us. But first, may I thank our sponsors, Expo 2023 Doha, Qatar, and the Worshipful Company of Gardeners for their continued support of the series. As always, we welcome our audience to participate in the conversation continuing afterwards on AIPH's Green City Forum, which is also where you'll find a recording of today's session. With an audience joining us from around the world, I'm certain we have a range of expertise. Now, it is my privilege to introduce the MC for today, Technical Advisor of AIPH, Audrey Timm. So, without further delay, please may I hand you over to Audrey.
Thank you very much, Frankie. And to reiterate Frankie's welcome to you all here today. I lead the AIPH Green City initiative that has multiple programs that serve to nurture a strategic shift in city form and function. The Green City Briefing series is one of these programs, and through these webinars, we promote knowledge to practice, and that's how we define the format of these series. The theme of today's session is Living Green for Economic Recovery and Inclusive Growth. This is a category in the AIPH World Green City Awards 2022 edition, which showcases cities that create systems and solutions that allow all city residents to overcome economic distress and thrive. The winner in this category was Hyderabad, India, for their work in creating a green necklace to the state of Telangana. And we heard from Hyderabad in the briefing session last November. You can watch the recording of this either on the AIPH YouTube channel or by joining the AIPH Green City Forum. Also a finalist in this category of the AIPH World Green City Awards was the City of Montreal for their 2020 to 2030 master plan for the conservation, improvement and development of Parc Jean Drapeau. Today in this session, we hear from the other finalist, the city of Mashhad in Iran. Their entry presented the transformation of Beltway to Greenbelt. Mashhad is located in the northeast of Iran. It has a population of over 300 million and about 20 million pilgrimages and tourists annually. Construction of a 27-kilometer highway project began in 1990 in order to facilitate citizens' access to suburban highways and reduce traffic pressure on the inner city streets. But within a few decades, they found out the negative effects of this highway impacted on the surrounding environment and the highlands. So they served a transformation of the belt. And this is the intention of their project. There were a range of projects, which was development of micro-purpose parks, natural mountain parks, and this was very much the transformation of the transport belt into a green belt. And in the session today, we'll hear from them. To start this briefing session, though, we have Dr. Julian Dobson to speak about his work on urban settlements and how they can be more socially just, sustainable, and inclusive. And I'll just remind you to post your questions in the chat and we'll get to them in the Q&A later. Julian Dobson is a senior research fellow at the Centre of Regional Economic and Social Research at Sheffield Hallam University. Julian is a researcher and writer with a broad interest in place and society and a particular focus on the complex systemic changes required to achieve environmentally and socially just approaches to urban life. His research expertise is in social and economic regeneration, urban green space, town and city centres, and the civic impact of universities. Over to you, Julian. Look forward to hearing about your work.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you for that introduction. It's great to be with you today. And as Audrey says, I'm a researcher with quite a broad interest around place and society. So I'm not a horticulturalist, I'm not a landscape architect, but I am increasingly interested in how we can green our cities and make them both greener and more socially just. So I'm going to share my screen, which hopefully you will be able to to see, which will have my presentation on it. So if for any reason you can't, then I'm sure that my colleagues will let me know. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today is the example of Birmingham in the UK and the approach that they've taken to investing in public green space using the concept of environmental justice as an overview. So first of all, this picture, which hopefully you can see on your screen now, of a kind of typical parkland woodland area in a typical British context, and you know, there are many places like this, both around Birmingham and elsewhere in Britain, where you've got these kind of semi-park and semi-natural woodlands, which are much loved and appreciated by local people. But the thing about them is that access to these spaces is not always equally available. People don't always feel welcome in these places, depending on who you are and where you live. People don't always feel that these spaces are for them. So environmental justice is a way of thinking about how do we approach green spaces, natural spaces, as a way of thinking about the distribution of environmental goods and harms. So the definition of environmental justice that I'm using today actually goes back about 20 years, but it's still really relevant. It describes two basic principles. First of all, that everyone should have the right and be able to live in a healthy environment, that they should have access to enough environmental resources for a healthy life. But in addition to that, it's important to realize that it's the poorest and least powerful people in society who have least access to these conditions. So it's not just good enough to say in a city we will provide public parks, but how do we ensure that those public parks are available, accessible to the people who will most benefit from them? And as well as thinking about environmental rights, our right to be able to enjoy these spaces, to access nature, there are also environmental responsibilities, and those are the responsibilities on our generation to ensure that future generations have a healthy environment, to ensure that the development that we do in our towns and cities doesn't create environmental problems or distribute environmental harms in ways that jeopardize people for the future. And the case study of Iran that you're going to be hearing about later, I think, is an example of how development has initially caused environmental damage, and some of the work that has been done to mitigate and reverse that damage and actually create accessible green spaces for everyone. So why does environmental justice matter? Some of the research that I've been doing and that colleagues around both my previous role in the University of Sheffield and my current role at Sheffield Hallam University has been, that research has been around access to green and blue spaces, and it's been showing that that access is not equal, and there's quite a substantial literature in academia that shows how not everyone has the same ability to access spaces that are good for them, and poor communities, even when they have public green spaces nearer their homes, those spaces are often of poorer quality. Poorer communities are also more vulnerable to environmental harm. So if you think about air pollution that tends to be concentrated around major roads, and people who live near major roads often tend to be poor communities in society. Traffic fumes, noise, industrial processes, contaminated land, things like that all impact more strongly on people who are of lower income or more vulnerable. And that's because obviously if you are affluent, you are more able to move to areas where those environmental problems are less. So when we think about green and blue spaces being watercourses, rivers, lakes, and so on, they don't solve the problems of poverty or injustice, but they do help to mitigate the harms that society generates. And they do that in two ways. First of all, by supporting physical and mental health and well-being. So if you are using a public park or a woodland or something like that, if you're able to escape from your everyday life into a place like that, then that actually helps you to cope with some of the other burdens and pressures you might feel in life. But in addition to that, these spaces support community interaction. They support socializing, meeting people, and often taking part in activities that not only do the local environment good, but also are good for your own well-being, because you're interacting with others who are engaged in what feels like worthwhile activities. So this is an example of the kind of space that I'm talking about. It's a park in Sheffield called the Ponderosa. It's quite close to where I live. If you look at the flats that are on the left-hand side of your screen, these flats are home to some of the poorest households within the city. But on their doorstep, they have this green space. It's not the best quality green space in Sheffield, but it's a space that is immediately accessible. It's literally on their doorstep. And it has a mixture of open spaces where people can play or picnic and gather and meet friends and family. It has areas of woodland that are home to different species of wildlife. It's got areas which have been planted up as a kind of community facility with blossom trees and fruit trees. So actually there's an awful lot for the local community in that space. And if you go there, not on the day when this picture was taken, which was quite bleak and cold and not very many people were around, but if you go there on a day like today, where the sun is shining and it's summer and people are out and about, you'll actually find that this space is really well used, and it's really well used by people who don't have a lot of income and don't have a lot of access to many of the other goods that society provides within a city. So what about biodiversity? We've spoken a bit about environmental justice, but where does biodiversity fit in? When we think about natural capital, we're thinking about the resources, the assets, the ecosystem services that support human well-being. So it's very much about seeing ourselves in relation to other species, both plant species and animal species, insects, that actually are part of the ecosystems within which we live. And that applies just as much in urban areas as it does in more rural areas. But that natural capital is unequally distributed. And that matters because people's connections with nature are important. So nature connectedness, what my former colleague Miles Richardson and others have been working on, it matters because it brings benefits for both human beings and nature. So improved mental well-being for people, but increased pro-environmental behaviours, which are good for plants and other species. So this is very much about biodiversity, even if it's not specifically an ecological issue. And just as an example of that connection with nature, I was talking to various people about their experiences of parks and green spaces during the COVID-19 lockdowns. And this is a quote from a young mother who took her children out to the local park pretty much every day and was saying, you know, we were really lucky because it's the spring. We went to the duck pond. There were baby moorhens. It was nice to go and see nature in all its glory. And this was from a family who didn't usually access the local park, who didn't, you know, who were usually out and about and too busy to do that sort of thing. So turning to Birmingham, this is one of Birmingham's green spaces, you know, a fairly typical one with lots of main grass, but also trees. It provides places to play, socialize, it provides shelter, it provides places where you can sit and contemplate. And the story of environmental justice in Birmingham is one of a city which in many ways is surprisingly green. There are 631 designated public parks or open spaces in the city of Birmingham. And that means that these are spaces that are big enough to have their own site boundary when they're marked on the council's map. So it's not just a piece of grass outside a housing estate or a school, but actually somewhere that is designated as having its own boundary. You know, so Birmingham's the second largest city within the UK, but you know, really well endowed with public parks. But unfortunately, public parks in England have suffered for more than a decade of underinvestment. The local authorities that are responsible for their upkeep have been increasingly short of money. Back in 2017, a parliamentary report concluded that parks in England were what they quoted as saying a tipping point of decline, where the resources to maintain and look after them were no longer guaranteed. And out of that understanding that parks were at risk, came a project called the Future Parks Accelerator, and two charitable organisations, the National Trust and National Lottery Heritage Fund, decided that they were going to invest in 8 areas, 7 of them in England and 1 in Scotland, where they would consider how the management and funding of public green spaces could be changed. Are there different ways of doing it which will enable those benefits to be retained and sustained for future generations? Shortly after this programme began, and myself and colleagues at Sheffield University and Sheffield Hallam University, the 2 universities in the city, were commissioned to evaluate this programme. But shortly after it started, the unexpected happened, the COVID-19 pandemic. And what happened as a result of COVID-19 is in March 2020, in the UK, as in other countries, lockdowns were imposed where people were really restricted in their movement in terms of where they could go away from their own homes and who they could meet with, who they could socialise with. And the immediate result of that was that people started using their local parks and green spaces a lot more and often discovering them for the first time. So at the time of the lockdown in April 2020, I interviewed one of the senior politicians at Birmingham City Council, and he was telling me, yeah, I think people have realised how great some of the green spaces they've got around the corner from their house are. They can't get out and drive. Perhaps they could spend a bit more time in the fantastic spaces we've got in this city. And that wasn't unique to Birmingham. We were getting the same message from other locations. And this guy was saying the other thing that has been really positive is more people are using the parks. And that means that they don't get vandalized. You don't get young people hanging around late at night causing what's perceived as being trouble. So actually by investing in parks, by making them places people want to go to, you actually solve some of the problems around maintenance and antisocial behaviour. So the Future Parks Accelerator was all about creating a case for investment. So at the beginning of the programme, January 2020, this was before the lockdowns happened, speaking to one of the Future Parks advisors in Birmingham. He was saying the ambition of our project is to bring about a mindset shift, to reevaluate the city's natural environment as a positive asset for the future, rather than the drain on resources. And this is key because in the past, local government looks at the budget for parks and says, why do we have to spend all this money? And so this was creating pressure, for example, to sell sites for development, for housing, because then the council would actually receive income by selling the sites and would be relieved of the responsibility to maintain them. But that's a very narrow way of thinking about it. And again, that decade of underinvestment, so this guy was saying, because of 10 years of austerity, we've almost started to close the door on the public because we can't deliver, we can't look after these places properly. And then just last year, summer 2022, talking to a council chief officer in Birmingham, he was saying it's been a massive change. Previously people just thought of parks within the council, decision makers, they would just think of parks as a place to go and sit in the sun, take the kids, have a game of football. They never saw the other connections and how good these places were for well-being and how important they were in terms of climate change. And now they do, now they get it. And he was saying it's a major game changer. So apologies for the messiness of this slide, but it was presented to me by colleagues at Birmingham Council, and it does actually have a lot of information about some of the conditions that that face Birmingham as a local authority and the people within Birmingham. So low income, lots of people who are excluded from employment, people who don't attain the education and skills that they could, lots of health problems, crime, poor access to housing. But within that, the living environment, air quality, number of road traffic accidents, quality of housing, actually Birmingham scores quite well. And so when you combine these issues of deprivation with issues of environmental justice, where we're thinking about things like access to green space, climate change effects such as the urban heat island effect, the higher temperatures experienced in urban areas, heavily built up areas, flood risks in urban areas which are exacerbated by lack of green space and much hard surfacing, and overall mortality rates. When you start to put all of that together, you can start to think of environmental justice as a lens through which we can start to look at these issues. And through the Future Parks work, Birmingham was able to put together a map which actually showed what this started to look like when you combine issues of access to green space, quality of the living environment, and deprivation. And that map, the red areas are those that are most deprived when you look in terms of environmental justice. And the map is segmented up by electoral wards. So each of these wards has a local representative within the city council. And it clearly showed that there was a big area in the city centre and towards the east of the city centre, northeast of the city centre, that wasn't getting the investment and resources that it needed compared with other areas of the city, the green areas or the yellow areas. So this work on environmental justice has been used to start deciding priorities for investment in the city. So through the Future Parks work, Birmingham developed what it called the Fair Parks Standards, a set of minimum quality standards to be achieved across the city's parks and green spaces, and they now call this the Future Parks Standard. And for those of you who are based in the UK and are familiar with the scheme called the Green Flag Awards, which presents awards to high quality park, it's the equivalent of the good rating in the Green Flag Awards. Now, what they found was that out of 600 plus parks in the city, at least 300 fell short of that standard. and need to be improved. So that's nearly half the parks across the city. But there's also an issue of distribution of areas that just don't have access to the same amount of green space. So in order to equalize distribution of green space or equalize distribution of access to green space, it was concluded that around 200 new green spaces were needed, new parks on, for instance, development sites. And those could be quite small, they could be pocket parks, but there were clear areas where people didn't have green space on their doorstep. And so the ambition is that over the next 25 years, all the parks and green spaces in the city will meet the Future Park standards. So thinking about how you decide priorities, going back to that environmental justice map, the 6 central wards, what are referred to by the council as the red wards, which have the worst environmental justice scores, are being targeted for investment first of all. And that approach is being piloted in the city centre in Bawdsley and Highgate wards. And then there's 5 other wards which will be prioritised. And the first investment is in a park called Garrison Lane, which is, it's what's in the UK we often refer to as recreation grounds, basically areas of mown grass that are seen as places to play football, more or less, or do sports, but that actually have very little else in the way of amenities. And what they're doing in Garrison Lane is improving the paths, new furniture, benches and bins to make them more accessible for more people, planting new trees and creating a kind of more secluded space, a contemplation area, they call it, which actually creates a bit more diversity in the park and a bit more biodiversity, where actually you're thinking of the park as a natural space and not just as a play space. And the City Council is working with a group of charities, of civil society organisations called Birmingham City of Nature Alliance, which is helping to plan and to raise funds to invest in these green spaces. And they've recruited what they call local green champions, which are local residents who will help to lobby for investment in these spaces and keep them on the local agenda. So where's environmental justice going? So I caught up with colleagues at Birmingham City Council last week to find out where we've got with this. And environmental justice is now being referred to in the context of what's known as CRVA, or climate risks and vulnerability assessments. And why have they changed it? Why have they changed the language? Well, what they've done is they've put the local idea of environmental justice into an international context. So a climate risk and vulnerability assessment is a planning tool which is a step towards building citywide resilience to climate change. And it's been developed by the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And there's a lot of resources available on their website, c40.org. Climate risk and vulnerability assessment involves identifying, measuring, monitoring and seeking to control risks, such as obviously effects of extreme weather, floods, drought, urban heating, but also planning to reduce the environmental harms done through human activity, including things like transport, excessive development, and so on. But as well as thinking about the risk to buildings and infrastructure, it also considers the impacts on human health and well-being, livelihoods, ecosystems and species, and economic and social effects. So it's quite broad, it's quite comprehensive. And risks are thought of not just in terms of risks to places and spaces, but also the risks of transition. That's the costs of change, as opposed to doing nothing. And the approach has been to build up a set of maps of which places are most vulnerable, most at risk, using this international methodology. So I won't go into this in huge detail because of time, but The first is a set of maps based on particular risks. So if you're looking at the left-hand side of the screen, at the top you've got 11 different maps. At the top, looking at things like particulate pollution, then moving on to flood risk from rain and rivers, then looking at the assets that are available in terms of green space and tree canopy, surface temperature, and IMD, which is the index of multiple deprivation, which actually talks about social conditions and issues of mortality. And you start to put all those maps together, which takes you to the middle of the screen, where that mapping is transferred onto a network of LSOAs, which stands for lower super output areas, which is the terminology that's used to map places at a neighborhood level. So when you talk about neighborhood level, you can see, as we saw with the environmental justice map earlier on, the red areas are the most deficient, the green areas are the ones that are best endowed. And then that mapping is validated through local case studies. So the next set of maps actually shows the CRVA score by location, showing this band in the center of Birmingham and to the east, which is most deprived. Then looking at that at a neighborhood level, where you've got these local units, and then comparing that with the electoral ward level, which is where how the environmental justice map was put together. And so you see that red area in the center of Birmingham actually correlates really closely with the environmental justice map. So it reinforces, using an international standard, the local work that was done through the Future Parks Accelerator, which actually shows that there are some areas of the city where people do not benefit from and enjoy the same access to green space. They are more at risk from environmental impacts of climate change, things like heating and flooding. And they are less able to manage those risks because of their personal vulnerability in terms of low income or ill health, for example. So what happens next? The climate risk and vulnerability assessment, it puts Birmingham's work in the context of an international response to climate change and transitions to a low carbon economy and society. And when we're thinking about planning green spaces and designing green spaces and the value that we get, the use we get from plants and flowers and from wildlife and ecosystems more generally, then we need to think about it in that context. So Birmingham's now looking to set up a city observatory to gather local data to better understand that process of prioritising investment. And there's been an initial work done on 2 inner city areas to the east of the city centre, Smithfield and Warnersfield. And that work is going to feed into the citywide development plan, which is currently in draft form. So just bringing us back to the headline of what this is all about. It's thinking about green spaces and parks, not as a liability, not as a drain on resources, but as an asset to our towns and cities. And because they're an asset, they're not just an asset by being there, but they're an asset because of what they do, the benefits they provide across populations. So that's the end of the presentation. This slide, which hopefully will be available to you all, shows some resources and further reading. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and take you back to Audrey.
Julian, thank you very much for that, for some very good examples and very good insights about local action linking with global objectives and global principles. So thank you very much for that. We'll come back to you in a bit for some Q&As and just some reminders. If anybody's got questions, pop them in the chat. So we'll Following on the theme of today, looking at economic recovery and inclusivity, we go to the speaker from the city of Mashhad in Iran. Now, we've had some troubles with internet signals, so we have a recording of a presentation, which we'll play for you in a moment. And our second speaker, the recording comes from Dr. Mahdi Mehrabani, and he's project manager for the development of west of Mashhad. He is a municipal engineer with a PhD in geography and urban planning from the Ferdowsi University of Mashhad. Mahdi has a background in urban, community, and regional planning, including an MSc from the Islamic Azad University. Alongside his work as a civil engineer, Mahdi also works as a university lecturer. So if our events team could play the recording, we look forward to hearing about it, and then I'll come back to use the audience with Q&A after that.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for accompanying me. And I have special thanks to AIPH, International Association of Horticultural Producers, to prepare this platform for us to present one of the greenest projects in Mashhad during the last decade. So stay with me during my presentation. Thank you very much. This project is entitled Transformation of Beltway to Green Belts. The project, which has been gone under operation 7 years ago by municipality of Mashhad. Let me start in this slide with a short and brief introduction of my city, Mashhad. Mashhad is located in northeastern part of Iran. In both photos, on the right-hand photo, which is an aerial photo of Iran, you can see the red GPS cursor, which shows approximately the location of Mashhad, and on the left photo you can see the 2D map of Iran and exactly the place of Mashhad city with again the red GPS cursor. In this slide I'm going to give you some demographic information of Mashhad. The city of Mashhad has got a population more than 3 million people due to the population census in 2018. And of course, more than 20 million visitors and tourists are visiting this city per year. Mashhad climate is cold, semi-arid with hot summers. And I'm sure that in the previous slide you were aware of this fact that Mashhad is really far from the two mountain chains which is spread from northwest to southeast, and the central mountain range of Iran, which is called Alborz mountain chain. And of course it has fallen apart from Caspian Sea and Oman Sea or Persian Gulf. So due to this reason, the city only sees about 250 millimeters, less than 10 inches of precipitation per year. And in recent years, this city has been facing a sharp decline in rainfall and water shortages. In the coming slide, and of course in the photo which is located on the right hand side, it is clear that long ago the urban planners and the consultant engineers of the comprehensive and detailed urban plan of Mashhad, they have designed a ringway, of course the second ringway of Mashhad, and in this photo they have been shown in 3 phases and in 3 different colors. The pass or the phase 1, which is shown in the yellow color, it connects the Mashhad Baghche on the northeast to Kalantari on the northwest of Mashhad. It is in operation now. The highway, which is shown by the blue color, which connects Kalantari on the northwest of Mashhad to Azadagan or Boronsi Boulevard. It is under construction with the physical development of more than 80%. And the part which has been shown by the red color, which connects Boronsi Boulevard to Mashhad Baghche, and it is called nowadays Green Belt of Mashhad, Southern Green Belt of Mashhad. Of course, it is in the vicinity of the Binalud and Hezar Masjid mountain change, and this part is the controversial project of Mashhad. The Mashhad Freeway and Southern Belt project was designed from the end of Shahid Boronsi Boulevard to Mashhad Baghche Highway with a length of 27 kilometers, and it is and its construction was on the agenda of Mashhad municipality since late 1990s. This project has got 2 phases and 6 parts. Of course, I mean the pass, which is shown by a red color. Phase number 1 with a length of 12 kilometers, phase number 2 with a length of 15 kilometers. Phase number 1 has been completed, and now it has been the Green Belt project or thematic park of Mashhad. Let me address the urban challenge which we have faced in the past 10 years. It was December 2013 that the implementation of the first phase of the ambitious Southern Belt project of Mashhad began with the aim of facilitating traffic and reducing the traffic load, and it was supposed to reduce the traffic load of the Mashhad Exhibition Square to the south. This road was started to be built on heights in the southwest and south of Mashhad, and at the end of 2016, after the progress of more than 80% of the first phase of the project, the protests of environmental groups and NGOs led to the fact that by the order of the Mashhad prosecutor and with decision of the Council for the government's headquarters, the use of a recreational area was defined for this project instead of traffic use, and the story of this controversial ended. I am adding that I think it was the first time in Middle East and of course in Iran that governments has come to this fact that they are to eliminate these highways and substitute them with recreational area and green spaces. It should be noted that up to the moment this project was stopped, more than $5 million had been spent on this project. Perhaps the most important drawback of this project is the lack of environmental considerations in the initial studies, despite the fact that the project has been approved in its official legal channels. But since the studies of this project were carried out more than 30 years ago, it lacked an environmental attachment. And in the next slide, you can see that so many experts, scientists, environmentalists, they have started protesting and claiming that continuing this project and constructing this highway is not suitable for the environment, and it's not suitable for the health of the Mashhad citizen.
پارک مشهد.
In the coming photos, which have been taken after the alteration of the usage of this place to Theme Park of Kuh Park, so you can see different people, cyclists, so many people with local clothing, and they are gathering in this park for different reasons, even cultural event, national event, or even for the food festival. They come here and they are having good time here. The ultimate goal of these mega projects are listed here. 1, promoting the value, nature, and climatic specifics of the region. 2, creating a place for people to connect with nature. 3, filling citizens' leisure time by using cultural ecosystems. And 4, creating a site for recognizing nomadic and rural ecosystem. Of course, we in municipality of Mashhad believe that this was an innovative and collaborative solution. We mean by alteration of the usage of this gray belt or beltway to green belt, or we can say Kuh Park, thematic park. We believe that it is an innovative and collaborative solution which can be repeated in other projects. Why? Because here we have the coordination between experts. So in order to persuade the governments to change the usage of this place to the recreational ecosystem for citizens and tourists, so many experts and scientists were involved. Of course, this project was comprehensively monitored by people, institutions, environmentalists, organizations, NGOs, and so on. And of course, we believe that the eliminating of this highway increase due to the will and desire of the citizens will increase the citizens' sense of belonging. In this slide, briefly, we are going to talk about the implementation, impact, and replicability hints of this project for Mashhad municipality and for Mashhad local government. First, this is the first experience of eliminating highways in Mashhad, even in the Middle East and in Iran. So acceptance of the performance change by the governors. So it is an outcome for experts and scientists in Mashhad that they come to this fact that the government respect their will and their desire. This method can be repeated by the citizens in other urban projects, especially their help in monitoring this type of project will be really helpful. It is the cause of reduction of the pollutants. Preserving natural resources is another outcome of such projects. Improvement of the urban environment, it is the result and the outcome of these types of monitoring by citizens and by scientists. Balanced distribution of leisure activities in the city we will have in near future with this type of alteration of land uses. Involvement of various groups, designed in coordination with various organizations and NGOs, paying attention to the environment, conducting environmental studies, and society satisfaction despite the costs. These are the important outcomes from this project. If talking of sustainability and resilience, of course, improvement through these types of projects, of course, these types of projects are the cause of reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide in the environment. Of course, we should plant trees and plants through these types of projects. Afforestation is another outcome of these types of projects. Increased air quality, restriction of car traffic, a reduction of the destruction of nature, use of natural material, and landscape perseverance is the outcome in the path of sustainability and resilience in this sort of project.
Well, that was really fascinating. Thank you very much, Mahdi, for preparing that recording, for sharing the interesting project of your city, Mashhad. It's very clear to see why it was a finalist in the category in the AIPH World Green City Awards, because it's created such change. And it's really been a fascinating example of rethinking an approach to built infrastructure. So if I gotta just ask Julian to pop back for a moment. Excellent. Well, interesting, Julian. So you showed examples of certainly Sheffield, where you live, for Birmingham. We've heard about Mashhad in Iran. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of sort of insights that are similar. But when looking at that, with your work dealing with different communities, what's your experience in how different people or organizations respond to changes in the landscape, looking particularly at access, looking particularly at quality of green space?
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. It was really interesting listening to Dr. Mehrabani's presentation, that he highlighted the role of civil society organizations in actually changing the attitude of public authorities. And I think increasingly, in the UK, we're seeing that local authorities are realizing that they have to work in partnership with community organizations. But there's, there are some challenges with that. There's been a particular issue, I think, in the UK where the people who traditionally volunteer in green spaces and in local parks are not seen to be representative of urban populations. So we have volunteer cohorts that tends to be elderly. There's obvious reasons for that. There are people who have time on their hands. They tend to be more middle class. They tend to be white. So there's real issues in terms of how do you make that sense of volunteering, connecting with your local green spaces much more inclusive. And that's something that the Green Champions initiative in Birmingham has been trying to do. I think as local authorities are increasingly stretched for resources, and there's a realization that you actually have to work hand in glove with communities, and there's a really good synergy there where you can actually work with people at a neighborhood level to think about what are the green spaces that might be a little bit more informal but are valued by local people. So so areas that could be made into pocket parks or local growing spaces, which may be areas that are too small to appear on something like Birmingham Council's map of green spaces, but actually they matter to local people, and people can engage around that. And what that does is it brings people together. So whether you're talking about this huge scale, as in Mashhad, or very much in a kind of hyper-local scale at your neighbourhood, there are ways that people can start to engage. And I think then what's really important is that there's a process for connecting that up with decision making.
There are some certainly good examples of that, of ways to engage the community, and programs you mentioned are really quite interesting and quite new, because you were talking about Ponderosa, and that might not be the best quality green space. I can describe the best quality horticultural green space, environmental perspective, even from economic perspective as to what would generate investment or create opportunities for income. But you're looking at a community, and what does good quality green space mean to a community? And so those levels of engagement.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's always worth spending time in a green space and just sitting down and watching how people interact and use that space. And yeah, so yesterday I was in Scotland in a place called Dunfermline, and there's a huge park called Pittencrieff Park, which was kind of gifted to the community by a local philanthropist. And people use it for all sorts of activities. So there were little kids learning to ride their bikes there. There were people in the children's play area, but there were also people just sitting in the shade, enjoying a bit of space on a hot day. There were kind of wooded areas where people can go for a bit of solitude and to get away from the pressures of their work or family life. But there's also social areas where you can get together with other people. So I think when we're thinking about planning and designing green spaces, it's important to think of the wide variety of uses that bring well-being benefits to the local community.
The multi-purpose. We're running to the end of time, so one final question, if I may. Speaking about multi-purpose, engaging with communities, getting local councils involved. But following on from the comments about the future parks, parks in crisis, what's your experience about the most effective approaches for getting businesses and local councils to buy into an idea or a project?
I think one of the key things is to think not just in project terms, but in terms of the overall network of green spaces and what it does for the communities. And that's something that's quite important that's come out of the Future Parks work. Thinking about mapping the ecosystem services that are provided across a city rather than just, what does this one local park do? And then when you think about kind of business involvement, it's, where are there opportunities for businesses to play a part in helping to finance investment in these places, but also where are there opportunities for businesses to actually engage in activities that are around corporate social responsibility, where they provide volunteer labour and help to support what's going on within the community. So the businesses are not just seen to be there to be for their own commercial reasons, but are actually helping to engage with local communities and to do what communities are looking for.
It sounds like there's great progress being made, good direction, a lot more to be done. Thank you very much, Julian. There's a question that's just come in, which is asking if you could share the link for the case study of Birmingham. So I'll pass back to Francesca. And if you're able, Julian, to pop that on or send it to me and we can pop it in the response, the email that goes out to all registrants.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Thanks a lot again. And I'll pass you back to Francesca.
Some brilliant insight there into the way that green development can occur in different cities as decision makers respond to social and environmental changes. Thank you to both our speakers, the recording, and to Julian live, and to Audrey for being today's MC. So the results of our poll. When we asked if you had experienced the power of plants to transform space in cities, we had 67% of you said yes, you knew directly, 22% knew of good examples, and 11% were hearing this for the first time. So I hope we've all taken away something new from today. I certainly have. Now, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Worshipful Company of Gardeners and Expo 2023 Doha, Qatar. Our next briefing is July the 11th at 1 o'clock British summertime, when we return to last year's City of Focus and hear about the changes occurring for climate resilience in London. But until then, join AIPH in showcasing the power of plants in creating resilient cities through discussion on the AIPH Green City Forum, on Twitter, and sign up to receive the global Green City update straight to your inbox. Thank you once again, everyone, for participating in today's webinar and for you for joining us. So wherever you are, whether it's good morning in Canada or good evening in the Philippines, have a wonderful day.
You are a seed, the beginning of a new awareness, a new global movement. You have life in you. Share it, spread it. Bring your thoughts and skills. Make it all fruitful. Tomorrow brings challenges and opportunities. Grow. Grow the resources to embrace science and experience for global sustainability. Grow the tools and use technology to cultivate a new and better future together. Grow the knowledge to reconnect to nature and promote a greener development. Grow the balance between local and global, planet and people, today and tomorrow. Growth starts with you. Welcome to Expo 2023, Doha, Qatar. Qatar has the perfect conditions for this growth to take roots. From Doha, we can grow a green desert and a better environment. Our Expo site consists of 3 main areas designed to host, gather, and inspire. Together we can sow the days of tomorrow for everyone to enjoy, everywhere. We are expecting you on the 2nd of October 2023. One Expo site, consisting of 3 character areas, is growing now to welcome you in 2023 to the future of horticulture. You are the seed and the movement that will gather the world in Qatar. Together in Doha, we will grow a green desert for a better environment.